When my daughter-in-law banned me from my grandson's birthday party because I smelled bad, I changed all the locks in my house. Now there won't be a party at all. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, and drop your opinion in the comments. Your support makes all the difference. The smell of motor oil and grease has always been with me, embedded in my calloused hands, in the dirty overalls hanging in the shop, in the hot metallic air of the small garage I turned into my home. I was never ashamed of it. I spent my whole life working as a mechanic, fixing hundreds of cars, putting food on the table, and raising my son with the sweat of my brow. I was never a man of luxury, but I was always an honest man. After my wife passed away, my family was just my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson. And when my son lost his job, I took them all in without hesitation. I gave them my house, my comfort, my security. And in return, I was treated like dead weight, an inconvenience. My daughter-in-law never hid her disdain for me. Her parents were important people, and she saw me as nothing more than a grease-covered old man, unworthy of being in her sophisticated family's presence. But I put up with it, for my son, for my grandson, until that day. I found out about the party by accident. A little girl from the neighborhood ran into my shop, excitedly waving a colorful invitation, a big celebration for my grandson's birthday. My heart sank. I didn't even know this party existed. They hid it from me. I went straight home. When I asked my son, he avoided my gaze, mumbling half-hearted excuses. But my daughter-in-law? She laughed in my face. You really thought you'd be invited? She mocked, crossing her arms. I don't want my parents having to deal with the smell of oil and grease. My blood boiled. She wasn't even trying to hide it. My own son stayed silent. He swallowed hard, pressed his lips together, but didn't say a single word to defend me. Something inside me snapped. For years, I had been ignored, insulted, treated like a nobody in my own home. But this was the last straw. I stood there, frozen in the living room of my house, feeling the weight of her words. Her voice still echoed in my mind, sharp as a blade cutting deep. I don't want my parents having to deal with the smell of oil and grease. My son stared at the floor, unable to look at me. The house that had once been my refuge now felt like a place where I no longer belonged. How did it come to this? How did I become a stranger to my own family? Answer me, boy. My voice came out deeper than I expected. Did you know about this party? He hesitated. Of course he did. Dad, it's not what you think. Not what I think? Then tell me, what am I supposed to think? He opened his mouth, but my daughter-in-law was quicker. Oh, for God's sake, do you really think this is such a big deal? No need to make a whole scene, you're so dramatic. Dramatic? My heart pounded. I wanted to yell, to finally say everything I had held back for years, but instead, I just let out a short, bitter laugh. What? She crossed her arms. Are you really gonna act all hurt now? Then a thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if I had never found out? If that little girl hadn't shown me the invitation, I would have never known. They weren't just excluding me. They were erasing me. And as if that wasn't humiliating enough, another truth came creeping in. Tell me something. I stared at my son, my voice low and firm. How did you pay for this party? He blinked, swallowing hard. What? The party, decorations, catering, venue. How did you pay for it? The color drained from his face. I didn't need an answer. I already knew. The money he had borrowed from me weeks ago, saying it was to fix the car. It was for this, for a party I wasn't even welcome at. My daughter-in-law noticed his hesitation and rolled her eyes. Oh, what's the big deal? You're so stingy. It was your money, wasn't it? End of discussion. That was it. A knot tightened in my throat, but not from sadness. From rage. "It's over," I muttered. They laughed. "What? It's over," I repeated louder this time. "Both of you out of my house. Now." Their laughter stopped. "Wait, what are you talking about?" my son asked, confused. I crossed my arms, an eerie calm settling over me. "I'm talking about the fact that you have until the end of the day to leave. This is my house, and you don't live here anymore." My daughter-in-law's eyes went wide before she scoffed, like I was joking. "You're crazy. You can't do that." "Oh, I can, and I just did." Before they could say another word, I pulled a keyring from my pocket and tossed it onto the table. "These are the new house keys. I changed all the locks this morning. Your stuff? It's already outside." For a second, there was absolute silence. Then my daughter-in-law exploded. "You can't do this!" She lunged at me, but I raised my hand. "No, you're the one who can't do this. I opened my home to you when you had nothing. I gave you a roof, food, support. And what did I get in return? Disrespect, lies, and humiliation. Enough. Get out." She screamed, cursed, threw whatever she could get her hands on. My son, still in shock, tried to argue, begged, said I was overreacting. But I was done. Done being humiliated. And so, with their bags and suitcases dumped on the sidewalk, I watched them leave. With nowhere to go, they slept in their car. But the story was far from over. That first night, I figured they'd find somewhere to stay, a cheap motel, a friend's house, maybe even my daughter-in-law's parents. But the next morning, when I left early to open the shop, there they were. My son's car was parked across the street. Inside, the two of them were curled up in the seats, covered with jackets. For a moment, a flicker of pity crossed my mind, but it vanished just as quickly. They weren't there because they had no other options. They were there to pressure me. I knew my son could ask his in-laws for help, but his wife was too proud to admit they'd been kicked out. They thought that if they stayed long enough, I'd cave. But I wouldn't. On the third night, my daughter-in-law finally swallowed her pride and went to her parents' house. My son, however, stayed, still sleeping in his car, still trying to convince me to let them back in. "Dad, this has gone too far," he said, as soon as he saw me leaving the shop. His face was tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "You can't just throw us out like this." "Yes, I can," I replied, not breaking my stride. "I know we messed up, but please, this isn't right." I stopped and turned to him. "Right? Now you want to talk about what's right? You lied to me. You tricked me. You spent the money I gave you on a party I wasn't even invited to. And now you want to lecture me on fairness?" He sighed, running his hands over his face. "Dad, at least think about your grandson." Hearing his name made my chest tighten. I was thinking about him the whole time. "I do, but do you? Because if you did, you wouldn't be spending money on a party while you're sleeping in a car." He stayed silent. I could have left it at that, but there was still something inside me, a wound that needed to be exposed. "Tell me something. If I hadn't found out about the party, would you have told me?" His silence was the answer. He never would have told me, and that hurt more than anything. I turned and walked away. On the sixth night, I woke up to a loud crash, glass shattering. I shot out of bed, grabbed a metal pipe I kept by the door, and moved cautiously down the hallway. My senses were on high alert. In the stillness of the house, I heard footsteps. Someone was inside. My heart pounded. Slowly, I stepped into the living room and saw a shadow near the broken window. Adrenaline surged through me, but all I saw was an intruder. "Get out, now, or I'm calling the cops." I pointed to the door. "No, you won't!" I pulled out my phone. "Last chance." She let out a short, hysterical laugh. "You'd really do it? You'd call the police on your grandson's mother? And you think breaking into my house helps your case?" She clenched her jaw, her eyes burning with rage. Then she saw that I was actually dialing. The phone rang once before she exploded. "You miserable old bastard! I gripped the pipe, flipped on the light and barked out, "Don't move!" The figure froze. As my eyes adjusted, a chill ran down my spine. My daughter-in-law. She was inside my house, a small cut on her arm from the broken glass. But in her eyes, something between desperation and hatred. "What the hell are you doing here?" My voice was firm. "You ruined our lives," she spat, trembling. "You left us on the street. My husband, he... She was trying to justify the unjustifiable. She bolted toward the door, but it was too late. By the time the police arrived, she was still outside, screaming. My son showed up, panicked, trying to reason with me, but there was no reasoning left to be done. She had committed a crime, and this time I wasn't going to save them. The officers arrested her for breaking and entering, as well as property damage. My son looked at me like I was a monster. "You destroyed everything." I just stared back. "I only finished what you two started." He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, and then he was gone. I didn't know where he would sleep that night, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty. In the days following my daughter-in-law's arrest, my house was quieter than ever, but it wasn't a bad silence. It was a peaceful silence. No more slamming doors, no more looks of disdain when I walked in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I truly owned my home again. But the peace didn't last. That afternoon, while I was in the shop changing a car's oil, my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Antonio?" "Yes. This is Carla Souza, a social worker with Child Services. We need to talk about your grandson." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened?" She sighed. "Since his mother is in jail and his father doesn't have a stable residence, the child is in a vulnerable situation. We need to assess the possibility of placing him in temporary foster care." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. "Foster care? My grandson? No, I can take care of him." "We need to evaluate that, Mr. Antonio. Can we schedule a visit?" "Come now." I dropped everything in the shop and rushed home, my heart pounding. I couldn't let this happen. When the social worker arrived, I was already waiting at the gate. I explained everything. How I had raised a child alone before, how I had a stable home, how I would never let my grandson be left without family. She listened, took notes, then said, "I understand your position, Mr. Antonio, but we need to speak with the child's father." I swallowed hard. "He'll agree." But I wasn't sure. My son had always been weak, always let his wife make the decisions. And now, with her gone, I didn't know what he would do. That night, I went looking for him. He was staying in a small motel, paid for with what little money he had left. When I opened the door and saw him sitting on the bed, staring blankly, I realized he wasn't the same anymore. He was broken. "What do you want?" he asked, exhausted. "You know what I want." He sighed. "The social worker called me." "Then you know your son might be sent to a shelter." He didn't respond. "Sign over custody to me." His head snapped up. "What?" "Sign temporary custody over to me. That way he stays with me in a stable home. He won't have to go through any of this." He rubbed his face with his hands. "My God, what happened to our lives? You chose a woman who destroyed everything. Now you have to choose whether you want your son to suffer for it." He was silent for a long time. Then, without looking at me, he murmured, "I don't know what to do." Anger bubbled inside me. "Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it." He took a deep breath. What if one day I want him back? Then prove you can take care of him. Prove you're a real father. But until then, he stays with me." He closed his eyes, and then, in a weak voice, he whispered, "All right." That night, we signed the papers, and the next day, my grandson came to live with me, a new life. When he arrived, small and confused, I hugged him tight. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he smiled when he saw the house. "Grandpa, do I live here now?" "Yes, my boy, you do." That day, we baked a simple cake and celebrated his birthday, just the two of us. He laughed, played, ate until his face was covered in frosting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt happy. My son and daughter-in-law may never forgive me, and I know that in the future they'll try to turn my grandson against me. But now I understand. No matter how much you give, some people will never respect you, and I refuse to live being humiliated. The first few days were quiet. My grandson still didn't fully grasp the change. He asked about his parents, but I gently changed the subject, telling stories, playing with him, cooking his favorite meals. And little by little, laughter returned to this house. At first, I didn't know how it would be. Raising a child at my age wasn't easy. But every night, when I saw him sleeping peacefully in the room that once belonged to my son, I knew I had done the right thing. It was better for him to be here with me than in a car or a shelter. My son visited a few times. At first, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. Then, little by little, he started accepting reality. One day, after spending the afternoon playing with his son, he lingered at the door, hesitating. "Dad," I paused. It had been a long time since he called me that with sincerity. "I know I messed up. I know I was weak," I sighed. "I know too." He lowered his head. I just wanted to say thank you. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to him." I looked at my grandson, running through the yard. "There's still time to fix things." He nodded slowly. "I hope so." Then he left. But this time, something felt different. My daughter-in-law was released from prison a few weeks later. She didn't try to contact me. I heard she went back to her parents' house. Time passed, and the pain gave way to something new. One morning, as I was finishing up a job at the shop, I felt a small tug on my sleeve. "Grandpa, look!" He was holding a piece of paper with a scribbled drawing of the two of us in the shop. At the top, written in shaky letters, were the words, "I love you, Grandpa." My chest tightened. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around that small boy who meant everything to me. For so long I let myself be treated like a burden, as if my worth was measured by the grease on my hands. But now, holding that drawing, I finally understood. My worth was never about how others saw me. It was always in the love I gave, and in the courage to never accept less than I deserved. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would never let myself be humiliated again, and for the first time in a long time, I was at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like to support our work. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one, and of course, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think.